Bible with Les Feldick. An Oklahoma rancher and farmer, Les Feldick has been teaching homestyle Bible classes for 20 years in Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas. Les Feldick's unique style of Bible teaching has made the books of the Bible come to life. When Les is teaching, it's so interesting that people say time just seems to fly by. And now, here is Les Feldick.
Okay, good to again have everybody in. We got a good gathering this afternoon, and for those of you on television, we bring these folk in and we do a 4-program session and tape 4 programs, just one right after the other, and we just appreciate so much that these folk come in and become part of our class and our audience. Now again, we always like to remind our television audience that all the past programs, beginning in Genesis 1:1, we've been coming up, as the program says, through the Bible. And all these past programs now are available in videotape as well as the printed page. Now these little books are just transcriptions, word for word, and we do not try to make anything on them. We just cover our printing costs, and for those of you who are interested, you call or write, and then we always like to emphasize missionaries are taking them, and under those circumstances we try to send them out free. But for the rank and file, if you can afford $5 for the book, we appreciate it, and we like to get around 20 or 25 for the tapes, depending on whether there's postage involved or not. So anyway, they always like to make folk aware that all of this material is available. It's a study course, I guess, in its own way, starting in Genesis and just coming on up through, and we are now, of course, up to the book of Romans. And so those of you here in the studio are already turned to Romans chapter 3. And for those of you out in television, you'll remember in our last program we wound up with God's great controversy with the human race, how he had built his case as a prosecuting attorney, not against any one segment, not against any one race, not against any one class, but he builds his case against the whole human race. And if you'll remember, in chapter 1 we looked at the immoral or the amoral man, and God builds his case as to why they are guilty. And then we looked at the moral man. On the outside he's good. There's just nothing that anybody can find wrong with him, but God has just as much to say about him as he does the immoral. And then the third category, of course, was the religious individual who thought because of his religion that he had everything that he needed to meet his Maker. And then we came to that great conclusion as we left our last program that all have failed, all are guilty, there is none righteous, no, not one. And so now we're going to pick up at verse 19 of chapter 3. Now whenever I teach Romans chapter 3, I always like to make a statement that there are 2 chapter 3s in the Bible that I think are mandatory for every believer to understand. The first one is Genesis chapter 3, where we have the account of sin and all of its horrendousness making its appearance when Adam rebelled and ate. And if you can understand chapter 3, why mankind is a fallen race, totally disobedient to everything that God says, and as a result of their fall, then we've seen the 6,000 years of human suffering, of degradation, corruption, evil, wickedness, and it all began back there in the garden. And so now God comes then to that conclusion here in Romans chapter 3 that this is the problem. And the only remedy is the remedy that God himself has provided. And this, of course, flies in the face of human reasoning. And we're going to see why here in just the next moment. So now as we come into verse 19, you'll just glance at the verses ahead of it, and you'll notice it's not a very pretty picture. But that's what God sees whenever he looks at a human being still in old Adam. That's where he saw me, that's where he saw you, and that's where he still sees every lost person. We are an open sepulcher. Our mouth is full of cursing, and we have no fear of God. Well, that's the picture of the unbelieving individual that God sees. So you come down now to verse 19 where it says, now we know. Now when Paul says we know, he's talking about something that's solid ground. This isn't wishful thinking. This isn't something that only a theologian could dream of. This is basic scriptural fact. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them who are under the law. Now I don't think any of you here have any trouble answering the question, who was under the law? The Jew. The nation of Israel was under the law. And that's why, of course, they were put in that place of special responsibility. God gave them the law, printed on the tables of stone and plain as day. And then, of course, they had the whole system of what we call law, the religious, the ritual, the sacrifices, the priesthood, the civil law. It all then comprised what we call the law. But at the heart of the law, of course, are the Ten Commandments. And so as we study these terms in Romans especially, we're always going to be careful. Are we talking about the Ten Commandments, or are we talking about the whole system of law? In other words, that if a Jew misused his neighbor, the law, the civil law, stipulated how he had to make things right. The ceremonial law designated that under a certain circumstance of sin or wrongdoing, he had to do such and such, bring it to the priest, and so on and so forth. And so you had the civil law and you had the ceremonial law, but at the heart of all of the law is the moral law, or what we call the Ten Commandments. All right, so now then, I think here in the first part of chapter verse 19, Paul, when he says the law says, it says to them who are under the law, he's talking about the Ten Commandments, the moral law. But it says to them who are under the law, that's the whole system of law. You get the difference? Now let's pick it apart one more time. We know that what things soever the law saith, thou shalt not. It says to them who are under the law, the whole system of law. The whole system, the nation of Israel. And they alone were under that. But it doesn't stop there. Now it goes on and says that not just Jewish mouths, but how many? Every mouth. Now who does that include? Everybody. Everybody. Jew and Gentile, black and white, rich and poor. Regardless of a person's status, he's under that demand of the law. And all the world, see that? Not just Israel now, but all the world may become, what's the next word? Righteous? That's what most people think. Oh, if they can just keep the law, they'll make it. But that's not the word. It says guilty. That all the world may become guilty before God. Now I can't stop there without taking the next verse. Therefore, since the law, the Mosaic 10 Commandments, since the law makes everyone guilty, therefore, by the deeds or the keeping of the law, shall no flesh be justified in his sight. Oh, now look at this last statement. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. Now underline that word sin, because I think it's the first time that we've really seen it here in the book of Romans, where it will take the application or the definition that I like to make of the word sin, S-I-N. And those of you who have ever been with me on a study of the Romans, you know what I'm going to say. You can put in its place, I think without exception, throughout the book of Romans. And of course, if it just doesn't fit, why then back away from it. But you can, without exception, substitute the word sin with old Adam. Old Adam. The old sin nature that we're born with. Now let me read it that way. Therefore, by the deeds of the law shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of old Adam. I'm going to give you a couple statements. Maybe I'll better take time and put them on the board, and I trust you'll write them in the flyleaf of your Bible. The first one I'm going to put up is, we are not sinners because we break the law. Hard to swallow, isn't it? Everybody thinks the reason we're sinners is because we've committed adultery, we've stolen, we've cheated, we've done something. But contrary to that, we break the law. That is the moral 10 now. We break the law because we are what? Sinners. Now that's contrary to what most religions teach. That's contrary to what 9 out of 10 church members think even today. They think the reason we're sinners is because we're always breaking the law. That's not the problem. The problem is we have something within us that wants to constantly break the law, and then, of course, when we break the law, we're what? We're guilty. See? But now we've got to go all the way back to Adam again, don't we? Because that's where it all began. See, when Adam was created, he was perfect. Not an ounce of sin in him, not a sinful thought. He was as pure, I think, as Christ himself was in his earthly advent. But how long did it last? Not very long. I think the Jewish people, the rabbis, probably feel long enough for Eve's first ovulation, which would be about 28 days. But whatever. As soon as Adam took that step of disobedience back there in the garden, a simple step, just simply took and bit that fruit that was forbidden, and immediately he became a sin-natured individual. And all he could constantly think in spite of himself was that which was contrary to the very laws of his Creator God. And every human being has inherited that ever since. So you see, this is where we are then in the first statement. We are not sinners because we break the law, but we break the law because we're sinners, and we're sinners because we are sons of Adam. Oh, if only people could get that straight. You're not a sinner today because of anything you have done so far as actively performing a sinful act. You're a sinner because you're a child of Adam. And being a child of Adam, everything that God says this do, old Adam says do the opposite. Everything that God says this thou shalt not do, old Adam says do it.